Let's be brutally unequivocally clear from the outset. You fundamentally control nothing, or at least, that is the pervasive, often deeply comforting, yet ultimately disempowering illusion that they, the unseen architects of influence, the subtle shapers of opinion, the master puppeteers operating in the shadows, have skillfully, almost hypnotically, made you believe. Pause for a moment, right now, suspend your disbelief, and think critically, with unflinching honesty, about all the times someone perhaps with disarming subtlety, perhaps with overwhelming persuasiveness, convinced you to do something you later questioned, adopt an opinion that didn't quite feel like your own, or follow a certain path without you even fully consciously realizing the true genesis of that impulse, that decision. Was it genuinely, authentically your decision born from your own unadulterated will, your own independent reasoning? Or did someone somewhere along the line expertly, almost invisibly plant the initial potent seed of that idea in the fertile, often unguarded soil of your mind? An idea you then unconsciously nurtured, watered with your own attention, your own rationalizations, your own emotional investment, until it inevitably, predictably bloomed into what you confidently, perhaps even proudly perceived as your own autonomous choice, your own brilliant insight. If you confidently, perhaps even defiantly believe right now that you have always acted purely based on your own unadulterated will, entirely free from external influence, untainted by subtle suggestion or psychological leverage, then you are likely living deeply, profoundly, dangerously within a meticulously constructed, self-perpetuating illusion. The truth, when faced without the comforting filters of denial or naive idealism, is often brutal, unsettling, and profoundly paradigm-shifting. The world, your world, is densely populated with incredibly skilled puppeteers, masters of subtle influence, psychological leverage, and emotional aikido, and if you are not consciously, deliberately, strategically striving to become one of them, understanding the invisible strings, mastering the subtle movements, recognizing the underlying mechanics of the game, then you're almost by default, by the very nature of these pervasive dynamics, likely functioning as the puppet, dancing to tunes you didn't compose, playing a role in a script you didn't write. But here lies the crucial, fundamental, often life-altering difference between those individuals who effectively, consistently control the dynamics of influence, who shape outcomes, who direct the flow of power, and those who remain perpetually controlled, passively, reacting forever at the mercy of forces they neither understand nor perceive. The former, the true masters of this intricate, often ruthless game, rarely, if ever, impose their will overtly. They don't need to resort to brute force, explicit coercion, loud commands, or aggressive displays of dominance. Such tactics are crude, inefficient, and often counterproductive, breeding resentment and resistance. Instead, they possess the far more sophisticated, far more potent, far more insidious ability to subtly, almost invisibly, make others act precisely as they desire, often entirely without the target even noticing the invisible hand guiding their choices, shaping their beliefs, directing their actions. True masterful manipulation, and let us not shy away from the word for it, describes a core human dynamic, whether used for benevolent or malevolent ends, is inherently invisible. It operates not as a loud, forceful command that screams for attention and invites defiance, but as a strategically placed, almost imperceptible whisper in the right ear at the precisely opportune moment. It functions not through direct, unambiguous instruction, which often triggers psychological reactance, but through the subtle, skillful implantation of an emotion, a flicker of fear, a spark of desire, a pang of guilt, a surge of pride, a wave of insecurity, that then organically, seemingly spontaneously motivates the desired action, the chosen belief. And perhaps the most unsettling, most challenging part of this entire dynamic for you to confront. You have already experienced it firsthand, likely countless times throughout your life from childhood to this very day, even if you failed to recognize it as such, even if you rationalized it away as your own free will. Remember the last time you inexplicably, perhaps even uncomfortably changed your mind about something significant, something you previously held a strong conviction about without fully understanding how or why that profound internal shift occurred. Perhaps it stemmed from a seemingly innocuous thought, a casual observation planted by someone else during a relaxed conversation, a thought that later took root and grew. Maybe it was triggered by an apparently innocent comment. A seemingly offhand remark dropped with calculated surgical precision, designed to land in a specific vulnerable spot in your psyche. Or perhaps it was initiated by a well-timed, subtly powerful gesture, a carefully calibrated look of disappointment from someone whose approval you crave, a shared, manufactured moment of feigned vulnerability, designed to create false intimacy, an unexpected, strategically deployed act of kindness, calculated to induce a sense of obligation. That right there is the locus of real enduring power, the subtle yet profound, almost alchemical ability to move others, shape their perceptions, guide their decisions, influence their beliefs without raising suspicion, without triggering conscious resistance, without ever revealing the true extent of your own agency in the matter. But here is the question that likely begins to make you feel distinctly uneasy, perhaps even a little defensive. What would genuinely happen if you were the one consciously, strategically controlling the board? If instead of being passively pushed and pulled by unseen forces, by the agendas of others, by the conditioning of your past, you were the one strategically, deliberately moving the pieces, shaping the narrative, directing the outcome? Because the fundamental, often unacknowledged difference between those who consistently win, who achieve their objectives, who wield influence effectively, and those who perpetually lose, who remain reactive, who are constantly outmaneuvered in this intricate, often invisible game of influence, is often remarkably, deceptively simple. The winners, the true strategists, intrinsically deeply understand that power isn't most effectively, most sustainably imposed through overt force, through loud demands, through aggressive confrontation. It is most effectively, most durably induced through subtle influence, through understanding human nature, through playing the long game. The core problem, the fundamental misdirection, is that most of us have been taught, conditioned, systematically miseducated about the very nature of influence and power. We have been persistently, often successfully sold the simplistic, naive, often demonstrably counterproductive idea that achieving influence, getting what you want, primarily involves speaking loudly, adopting an authoritative posture, aggressively, imposing our will upon others, demanding compliance. But observe closely, with a discerning, critical eye, those individuals who really run the world, who truly shape outcomes behind the meticulously crafted scenes. Whether in the corridors of political power, the boardrooms of multinational corporations, or even within the complex, nuanced dynamics of social hierarchies and intimate relationships, they rarely, if ever, need to raise their voice. They don't need to resort to overt displays of dominance, for such displays are often signs of weakness, of insecurity, of a lack of more sophisticated tools. True strategists, the quiet puppet masters, possess the far more sophisticated, far more potent, far more enduring ability to make others enthusiastically, passionately follow their ideas, champion their causes, execute their plans, genuinely, fervently believing those ideas, those causes, those plans originated entirely within themselves, born of their own brilliant insight, their own moral conviction, their own free will. And that right there is the crucial, game-changing insight that no one, absolutely no one, likely ever explicitly, honestly told you. That effective manipulation, and let us use the term here not necessarily in its pejorative, morally loaded sense, but in the pragmatic, strategic sense of skillful, often invisible influence, isn't fundamentally about shouting louder than everyone else, making overt, unambiguous threats, or engaging in forceful, direct coercion. It's not about logically, painstakingly convincing others with impeccable arguments, irrefutable data, or overwhelming evidence. For logic, as we know, is often a weak motivator in the face of strong emotion or entrenched belief. It's not about imposing your viewpoint through sheer force of personality, through charisma alone. Though charisma can be a useful tool, it is something far, far subtler. It is an intricate psychological dance, a nuanced, often invisible interplay of understanding deep human nature, of recognizing unconscious patterns, of leveraging emotional triggers, where you skillfully, patiently, often imperceptibly guide people to walk precisely where you want them to go, to desire what you want them to desire, to believe what you want them to believe, often entirely without them ever realizing they are being gently yet deliberately, purposefully guided. Do you genuinely, truly want to understand how it works? Are you prepared to look behind the curtain to see the mechanics of the machine, even if what you find is unsettling, even if it shatters some of your most cherished illusions about human agency and free will. First, you must meticulously, strategically identify the right people. This is not about indiscriminate influence. That's inefficient and often counterproductive. Don't waste your precious energy, your valuable time, your strategic resources trying to manipulate everyone you encounter. That is the path of fools. Focus your efforts, your keen attention, strategically laser-like only on those individuals who really matter to your specific objective, your desired outcome. And crucially, within that select group, identify those who are most psychologically susceptible to subtle influence, to the kind of indirect guidance we are discussing. Look for the impressionable ones, those easily swayed by displays of confidence, by articulate charisma, by the allure of a compelling narrative. Seek out those who are perhaps unconsciously deeply seeking guidance, craving direction, longing for certainty even while outwardly performatively professing staunch independence and self-reliance. Target those individuals who sincerely, passionately believe they are making their own decisions, who champion their own autonomy, but who in reality, upon closer, more discerning observation, demonstrate a consistent, predictable pattern of needing or wanting someone else, a stronger personality, a perceived authority figure, a charismatic leader, to implicitly, invisibly make those critical decisions for them to provide the unacknowledged framework for their choices. These are your prime candidates. Second, you must master the delicate, almost surgical art of making them believe the idea is inherently theirs. This is paramount, psychological resistance, that innate human tendency to push back against perceived external control, naturally, almost magically dissolves, often completely, when people feel a genuine, profound sense of ownership and control over a decision, an idea, a course of action. If you desire someone to undertake a specific action, to adopt a particular belief, do not simply tell them to do it directly. For this blunt approach often triggers immediate, sometimes fierce reactance, the "you can't tell me what to do" reflex. Instead, you must subtly, patiently, almost invisibly implant the seed of the idea. Let them arrive at the desired conclusion. Your desired conclusion seemingly on their own through their own brilliant thought process. A strategically placed open-ended question here. Have you ever considered the possibility that a carefully dropped, seemingly innocuous hint there? It's interesting how X, when combined with Y, often leads to Z. I wonder why that is. A shared anecdote that subtly illustrates the desired outcome. Remember, the human mind instinctively, powerfully hates being given direct orders, being told what to think or do, but it absolutely passionately loves its own perceived ideas, its own insights, its own aha moments. If you execute this step correctly, skillfully, patiently guiding their thought process, without ever revealing your hand, without ever appearing to push or coerce, they will often passionately, fiercely defend your plan, your idea, your agenda, as if it were entirely their own brilliant, original creation, their personal brainchild, and they will pursue it with far more conviction and dedication than if you had simply commanded them. Third, you must learn to effectively, strategically fragment the opposition. This is a timeless principle of power as old as human conflict itself. The single biggest threat to maintaining control, to achieving influence, to successfully implementing your agenda, is rarely individual resistance alone, for isolated individuals are often easily managed or dismissed. The real danger, the existential threat, is the organization of that resistance into a cohesive, unified, purposeful force. If a group of people, however small, initially successfully unites against you with a common purpose, a shared grievance, a unified vision, your control over the situation, your ability to influence outcomes rapidly diminishes, often collapsing entirely, sometimes with devastating speed. However, if you can skillfully, subtly manage to plant seeds of doubt, mistrust, or suspicion among them, if you can cleverly provoke small, seemingly insignificant internal divisions, factionalism, or personal conflicts, if you can artfully, insidiously make them turn against each other, focusing their energy, their resources, their attention inward, on their internal squabbles rather than outward towards challenging you, they inevitably, predictably weaken themselves, often neutralizing their collective power before it can ever be effectively brought to bear against you. Divide and conquer. This is not merely a military maxim, it is a fundamental principle of psychological warfare and social control. But understand simply, dividing isn't always enough for sustained long-term control or influence. If you genuinely want to exert lasting, profound influence, you absolutely unequivocally need to understand to master the profound, almost irresistible power of human emotion. Logic, while important for justification and rationalization, primarily moves thoughts. It appeals to the intellect. It is emotion that fundamentally, powerfully, consistently moves actions. No one acts consistently, passionately, self-sacrificingly, solely based on cold, dispassionate reason. People are ultimately primordially driven to act, to change, to commit, because they feel something intensely. A surge of fear, a burning desire, a gnawing insecurity, a swelling of pride, a sting of envy, a beacon of hope. Your task as a true strategist of influence is to accurately, almost intuitively identify what core emotion, what dominant psychological driver motivates each key individual you seek to influence, and then skillfully, often indirectly, use that specific emotion, that identified vulnerability, as leverage. Don't just tell them what to do or why they should do it logically. Make them feel deep within their being, in their gut, in their soul, that doing it, believing it, following you is absolutely necessary. Perhaps for their survival, their success, their happiness, their sense of belonging, their very identity. Tap into their deepest hopes, their most profound fears, their unspoken aspirations, their hidden shames. Connect your agenda to their emotional core, and you will unlock a level of influence that mere logic can never achieve. And here, inevitably, we arrive at the potentially most dangerous, most ethically fraught, most personally transformative part of this entire endeavor. Because engaging in this level of psychological influence, consciously, deliberately playing with the minds and emotions of others, inevitably, unavoidably comes with a significant, often hidden price. It carries inherent risks, profound potential consequences, both external and internal. If your manipulative tactics are discovered, if your subtle guidance becomes too obvious, too transparent, if the curtain is pulled back to reveal the puppeteer, you risk instantly, irrevocably, becoming perceived as the enemy, the deceiver, the exploiter. You risk losing all trust, all credibility, and potentially of facing significant, sometimes devastating backlash, social ostracism, reputational damage, even legal repercussions. Furthermore, and perhaps more insidiously, if you begin to abuse this power, if you become intoxicated by your ability to influence, to control, to shape others' realities sooner or later, someone else, perhaps a rival seeking to usurp your position, perhaps even a former ally you have betrayed or underestimated, perhaps simply a more astute observer, will inevitably learn your methods, decipher your patterns, and potentially lethally use them against you. Control, influence, manipulation, these are all potent double-edged weapons, and like any powerful weapon, they possess the inherent, undeniable capacity to turn against the wielder, especially if wielded carelessly, arrogantly, or without a profound understanding of their potential for blowback. History, both grand and personal, is replete with cautionary tales, with tragic sagas of brilliant strategists, masterful manipulators, charismatic leaders who ultimately fatally believed they were invincible, untouchable above the rules of the game, until someone else, perhaps quieter, perhaps more patient, perhaps simply hungrier, learned to play the game better, more ruthlessly than they did. That is why the ultimate, final, most critical question is not merely whether you can learn to effectively manipulate or influence others. That is a question of technique, of skill acquisition. The far more critical, more ethically significant, more soul-searching question is, are you genuinely, truly willing to accept to bear the potential consequences, both external and internal, both seen and unseen, of consciously, deliberately choosing to operate in this manner? Because once you deliberately, knowingly cross that ethical, psychological line, once you begin consciously, systematically wielding these powerful, often invisible, psychological tools to shape others' realities for your own ends, there is often no easy, simple turning back to a state of naive innocence, to a world perceived through rose-tinted glasses. The knowledge once gained can rarely be ungained. The path once trodden often changes the traveller irrevocably. Now you know. Now the veil has been at least partially lifted. Power, true, enduring power, the kind that shapes destinies and alters the course of events, is rarely about overtly, forcefully compelling compliance through fear of punishment or promise of reward. It is far more effectively, far more sustainably achieved through subtly, almost invisibly guiding choices, shaping perceptions, framing narratives. It's often not about dominating the conversation by constantly loudly speaking by imposing your voice. It's about skillfully, patiently making others speak for you, passionately championing your ideas, your agenda, as if they were entirely their own, born of their own conviction. And the great central, often misunderstood paradox of power is this: the less it overtly visibly seems like you possess or are exerting control, the more genuine, profound, deeply rooted control you often actually have over the underlying dynamics, over the true flow of influence. The world, make no mistake, is fundamentally not run by those individuals who simply shout the loudest, possess the most overt, officially sanctioned authority, or display the most aggressive postures. It is consistently, quietly, almost invisibly shaped, directed, controlled by those rare, often underestimated individuals who understand on a deep, intuitive, almost visceral level how to quietly, skillfully, patiently pull the invisible strings operating within the profound, often silent, often unconscious depths of human psychology. The fundamental question therefore remains starkly, challengingly, unavoidably before you. Will you choose to remain passively, unconsciously a puppet, forever reacting to strings you don't even perceive dancing, to tunes you didn't select, living out a script written by others? Or will you finally decisively summon the courage, the discipline, the unwavering resolve required to learn how to consciously, strategically, perhaps even masterfully handle the strings yourself? But understanding these basic, albeit potent mechanics of influence is merely the rudimentary beginning, the entry-level course. If you genuinely, truly desire to achieve something approaching true mastery in the complex, often treacherous art of influence, you need to delve far beyond these initial tactics, these superficial maneuvers. You need to grasp something far more fundamental, something profoundly powerful, something that most people, even those who consider themselves savvy or worldly, never truly come to grasp in its full, almost terrifying potency. People do not primarily follow ideas, they follow emotions. They are moved by feelings, not by facts alone. Think critically deeply about any truly great transformative movement in human history, any profound social change that has reshaped civilizations, any charismatic, almost mythical figure who has undeniably, irrevocably altered the course of humanity. How did they achieve such profound, lasting, earth-shattering impact? Was it primarily solely through presenting flawlessly logical arguments, meticulously supported by irrefutable data, by cold hard objective facts? Rarely, if ever. Far more often, their immense power, their almost hypnotic influence stemmed directly from their uncanny, almost preternatural ability to tap into, to awaken, to amplify, and to skillfully mobilize powerful, often latent collective emotion. They articulated a compelling, resonant vision, often one of struggle and triumph. They painted a vivid, almost tangible picture of a desired future or a feared alternative. They evoked a shared, deeply felt feeling, whether it was the soaring elation of hope, the galvanizing terror of fear, the burning sting of injustice, the profound comfort of belonging, or the intoxicating allure of aspiration that resonated deeply primordially within the hearts and souls of people, compelling them to move beyond mere intellectual agreement, beyond passive assent, towards passionate, often self-sacrificing action. Because the moment potent, visceral emotion enters the equation, pure, dispassionate logic often becomes largely, sometimes completely irrelevant, swept aside by the overwhelming tide of feeling. Have you ever observed, perhaps with a mixture of bewilderment and frustration, how people will often fiercely, passionately, sometimes even violently defend ideas, beliefs or ideologies that they cannot even cogently, logically explain or rationally justify? How they will vehemently, unyieldingly fight for deeply held convictions that they have likely never once subjected to rigorous, unbiased, critical questioning, never once examined with true intellectual honesty. This phenomenon, so common, it's almost invisible, happens precisely because those ideas, those beliefs, those ideologies have become inextricably, often unconsciously tied to their core identity, to their fundamental sense of belonging within a specific group, a tribe, a community, to their very perception of who they are, what they stand for, and their place in the vast, often confusing tapestry of the world. And here, right here, lies the absolute undeniable key to profound, almost invisible, deeply embedded influence. if you genuinely desire to deeply, lastingly influence someone's behavior, their perspective, their allegiance, strive not just to convince their intellect to win the logical debate. That is a superficial victory, easily overturned. Instead, strive to make your idea, your narrative, your agenda, subtly, almost imperceptibly become an integral, indispensable part of their perceived identity, their self-concept. Why is this so devastatingly effective? Because while people might, under pressure or with new information, readily change their superficial opinions, admit to minor errors in judgment, or even acknowledge logical flaws in their previous thinking, they cannot easily, willingly change their fundamental sense of identity, who they believe themselves to be, without significant, often excruciating internal resistance, without a profound crisis of self. No one wants to readily, publicly, or even privately admit, even to themselves, that they have been fundamentally deeply wrong or misguided about who they are, what they value, what they believe in for their entire life, or for a significant portion of it. That is too psychologically threatening, too destabilizing. But if you can skillfully, patiently, almost invisibly manage to get them to unconsciously adopt an idea, your idea, as part of who they perceive themselves to be, as a cornerstone of their identity, they will then often defend that idea, that belief, that narrative to the death. Not necessarily because you explicitly directly ask them to, not because of any external reward or punishment, but because defending that idea now feels on a deep, visceral, unconscious level synonymous with defending their very reason to exist, their sense of self-worth, their core values, their place within their chosen tribe, their very sanity. This is precisely where we enter potentially dangerous, ethically ambiguous, psychologically profound territory, because this level of influence, this deep embedding of ideas into identity, transcends common persuasion, simple debate, or everyday argumentation. It's not merely about logically convincing someone of a particular viewpoint of the merits of a specific course of action. It borders, quite frankly, on a form of subtle, insidious psychological programming, the intricate, often invisible art of inserting an idea, a belief, a directive deep into someone's mind, often entirely, without them even realizing it was strategically, deliberately planted there from an external source, often by you, and achieving this profound, almost alchemical level of influence, the kind that makes people follow you or your ideas without conscious questioning, without internal resistance, often with fervent devotion, typically requires mastering three crucial interconnected elements: strategic, exposure calculated, repetition, and potent visceral emotional connection.